So now to introduce our first keynote of the day, it is our great honor and privilege to welcome Indy Johar. Indy's practice is focused on the strategic design of new super-scale civic assets for social innovation and transition towards deeply democratic futures. And this is operating specifically at the intersection of financing, contracting, and governance. Indy is co-founder of Dark Matter Labs and the RIBA award-winning architecture and urban practice Architecture 00. He's a founding director of Open Systems Lab, the WikiHouse project, and the open-source furniture company Open Desk. Indy is also a non-executive international director of the BloxHub, which is based here in Copenhagen, BloxHub being the Nordic Hub for sustainable urbanization. And this is the location where we first heard Indy's striking ability to articulate the many dimensions and entanglements of our collective problem space, but also his inspiring ability to shed light on radically alternative and foundational approaches towards tackling it. A central thesis of his work is that the creation of a truly equitable and sustainable building culture can only be achieved through a radical rethinking of the infrastructural and legislative frameworks that surround us. We're delighted to invite Indy to the stage to unpack this further for us now here at FABRICATE. Indy, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Super honored and delighted to be here. I'm going to speak today about what I think is often not spoken about, which is the nature of the constraint space that I think is going to change the nature of how and where we innovate. And what I'm going to put forth to you is that we've got a radical shift in the constraint space of the world that we're going to be operating in. So this is not necessarily a sort of an easy talk, but it's certainly the talk that I'm sort of facing up to. And it's an evolution of a lot of our thinking, but I want to put it down in a way that forces us to engage with what does it really mean to fabricate the 21st century? Because I think it's going to be fundamentally different from the 20th century, and it's probably going to be materially different. So let me start with this. How many people here are vegan? Superb. Congratulations. Put your hands up. And I mean that, right? Like, how many of you are Trump-like? Put your hands up. Do you believe in Trump? I'm just using it as an example. So, that is all the wild animals in the world. All of them. Zebras, elephants, whatever you like. See the amount of cows? Pigs? So when we talk about the Anthropocene, that's what we're meaning. The world is a farm, and there's some little zoos lying around. You are the agents of the farm. And I think it's really important for us to face up to the scale of what we're in the middle of. So everyone talks, I go to places, everyone goes, I've got this sorted, we're going to build a timber house, and it's zero carbon. And I'm like, okay, great. So have you looked at the nature of the biomaterial economy? So what we've got is massive strategic soil loss. I don't know if many of you have listened to Breakthrough by Professor Jim Blundell. Really recommend you listen to him. He talks about what's happening to our agricultural food systems and our soil systems around the world. And so what I want us to start to think about is not just the dreams that we have of what we want to fabricate, but the underlying constraints and how they're changing. So soil systems are degrading worldwide. We know that we've got net loss in agricultural land and soil infrastructure around the world. And at the same time, climate breakdown, please note I'm using the word climate breakdown, not climate change. It's a breakdown of weather predictability. As a result of that, what you're going to see is increased pressure on our food systems. So we all think we're going to shift towards a biomaterial economy whilst we've got increasing pressure on, effectively, our food systems. Yet we're all continuing to eat meat. Right? So I just want to make sure those linkages are sinking through. You carry on putting pressure on the soil by diets which are not plant-based. We don't have the agricultural land use to be able to build a biomaterial economy. That's essential to actually building, say, any of the kind of bioregenerative food supply systems or actually the material economies that were required. At the same time, in terms of biodiversity, we're probably in the middle of one of the mass extinction events, effectively, of biodiversity around the world, as a result of what you saw at the beginning, right? So why is that important? Well, our mineral economy is pretty much attributable, which is mining and everything else, as attributes about 80% of our biodiversity losses around the world. What do you think the percentage of increase of our mineral economy is like as we go towards a renewables revolution? 600% increase by 2050. 600%. Remember, renewables aren't yet renewables. After 25 years, you need to replace them. Right? Wind turbines, they're not yet renewable. We are trying to make them so. Our solar infrastructure is not yet renewable. We are trying to make it so. After 25 years, most of them need to be replaced. And we're already in the first round of replacement cycles. Now, I'm not trying to sort of say, don't do this stuff. What I'm trying to say is engage in the reality of what we're facing to see what the opportunity space is. Same time, yeah, fishing, vast amounts of increase in dead zones. Pretty much all of us have mycotoxins inside our bloodstreams and microplastics in our bloodstreams. Actually, it's often now even been related to heart disease and other issues. So the systemic pollution of the biosphere is so significant that it's now causing us human health and human impacts. Now, why I'm saying all this is that I think it's really critical for us to realize that climate change or climate breakdown is just one symptom of a much more structural failure in how we're organizing and relating to the world. I always like this slide, especially in Denmark. Denmark is 4% circular. It is the best economy in Europe for circularity. The best. 4%. It is the best, right? Global average is 7.2. Where's that being made up? It's not being made up in the global north. It's largely made up in the global south. Now, why I'm saying that is when people say, oh, we're gonna build circular, we have a mammoth mountain to climb, going from 4% to 90%. Right? Many of you probably have businesses. If I was to turn around to you, so change your business model by 30%, if you speak to businesses, they'll say, not possible. If I ask you 10%, you said yes, 15% difficult, 20% virtually impossible, 30% not. I'm talking about a 90% shift in the nature of our material economy. Now, I don't think we're anywhere close, and I'll go through some of the numbers, and I want us to be real about how not close we are. And the reason for that is it starts to show what the scale of the transformation our economies are facing as we move from an industrial waste, linear waste society to a circularity society. It is not a marginal transition. It's almost a rebuild of our economies at root level. At the same time, all the good news is often very straightforward. I often sit in rooms, people say solar prices going down. But you do know global hydrocarbon energy, global hydrocarbon-driven energy, year on year has increased in the world. Year on year, our pull from hydrocarbons has increased, whilst Actually, our solar and our renewable energy supply has also increased, but year on year, we're still going up in hydrocarbon supply. So in 2019 to 2020, global demand for energy increased greater than all the installed renewables. Right, just to give you, and this stuff comes from Nate Higgins. He's one of the best energy people in the world. Look him up on podcast. I'm going to give you some names of people that I think are world-class exceptional. And I think then we have to face up to what this transition really means. So one of the kind of shocking moments for us was everyone was talking to us, we were working a lot on whole city retrofits. How do we retrofit the whole city? And in terms of dealing with energy and demands and everything else. And one of the things that we started to realize was, we don't actually have the mineral infrastructure to actually retrofit the city. We don't actually have the mineral infrastructure. So copper supply, right? Just every city is talking about electrification. It takes 10 years to open up a copper mine. And remember, 90% of our biodiversity losses are driven by mining, by the way. So if we then focus that, we are talking about effectively, it takes 10 years to open a mine. We do not have the copper infrastructure. We have global enough reserves, but the mining, the refining landscape to be able to deliver the copper doesn't exist. That will take us 10 years to deliver the electrification that everyone's talking about. And we're working on this, right? This is not like hypothetical numbers. We're working on the electrification of cities, and you start to realize what the implications are. And then actually some of the kind of fundamentals. So everyone, largely, if you look at the policy infrastructure that we're working in, we're almost certainly heading towards 3 degrees. Firstly, there is virtually no adaptation work going on. The adaptation work is largely minimal. No one knows how to fund it. But secondly, what does 3 degrees really mean? People just are now casually talking about it. 3 degrees global average temperature rise means 5 degrees global average land, and in urban environments up to 8 degrees warmer. 8 degrees warmer. So, for example, I was in a retrofit conference in London, and everyone was still talking about heating. And I was like, But if you look at the projections, the likelihood is it's cooling load, which is going to be the biggest issue facing our cities. It's cooling load. It's not the heating load. Because we're still looking back at the 1970s and saying, what's our energy demand? Where is it rooted? We're not looking forwards into saying, what's the energy demand of the future looking like? And the real global implications of that, so we can talk about it very casually, we're talking about vast amounts of the Earth becoming non-human inhabitable, or outside historic human niche zones. So when people talk about 1 billion people being on the move, or 3 billion people being on the move, that's what you're talking about. By the way, I've not spoken at all about rain. Remember, climate breakdown is increasing the volatility of our weather systems, and it's increasing the energy of our weather systems. So rain, wind, solar gains, all of these things are effects that are part of the story. Next, I don't know how many of you engage with some of the problems that we're starting to see, but in the kind of finance side. But one of the things that's becoming very clear is that, and this is really important, right? We often talk about climate change, and I think it's really critical we don't say change. We talk about breakdown of predictable weather. That is what we're seeing. You have a loss of predictable weather. What you see is the loss of insurability. And the loss of insurability means you see the loss of capital markets. So already, places like in Nova Scotia, for example, it is no longer possible to get your house insured. In places like in Australia, the cost of insurance of a house is about 500,000 Australian dollars a year, which is the replacement cost of the house itself. In places in the US, in California, you cannot get the houses insured. And what that means, practically, we figured this out when we were doing the WikiHouse and open source housing, if you can't get insurance, you can't get a mortgage. Can't get a mortgage, you can't build for everyone. It's really simple. So 70% of the transactions in New York are now cash-only transactions. So if you want to talk about inequality, this is going to be one of the fundamental drivers of inequality. Second, and I think this is something that's going to become more and more critical in the world we're making, is we're seeing security become the dominant narrative of how we're organizing our economies. And I don't mean security just in terms of geographic security, but a systems view of security. Food, energy, water, material systems, all becoming seen as part of a security domain. More and more, what is a market? What is the nature of the market when you're talking about food from a security lens? And that's going to reshape our food economies and our food environments radically. Next, I think it's really vital that we recognize that the classes of problems that we're facing, unless we can find a pathway to justice, there will be no transition. Unless we can find a pathway to justice, there will be no transition. And remember, even if Denmark or the UK make the transition, we're all dead in the water unless the whole planet does it. This is a class of problem that requires actually some form of collaborative planetary scale action we've never done before, we've never seen before, other than war. So my number one message here is we're going to be seeing a foundational shift in our base economies. And that means our material economy. We're going to see our material economy, we're going to have to move most of our material consumption and make it intangible. We cannot consume the amount of minerals. Remember, the Scandics per capita consume more than anywhere else in the world. Per capita. We're going to have to massively reduce our material consumption. That's where we are. We're going to have to shift value creation to the intangibles economy. Second, we're going to have to make our material economy massively durable. Third, we're going to have to make it circular and deconstructible. And fourth, we're going to have to make it regenerative. There are four issues that are going to recast everything we make around us in the world economy. Next, everyone talks about bioregenerative economies. Great, I love it. Unless we can figure out land use transition, there are parts of Denmark, for example, which have the best land in Denmark that are being used for pig farming. Right? We're going to have to transform our land and how we use our land in radical formats. This is going to be number one innovation in terms of land use transition. And how do we do it in democracies? How do we do it in democracies where we don't use a forcing function? How do we do it in democracies where we don't set up polarization, as we're starting to see the politics of land use transitions or nitrous oxide, dioxide actually become on the streets of Netherlands, which is what we're seeing. How do we do that? These are going to be real 21st century design challenges. We are going to have to reform our food system. So I think one of the things I often say is that it's very clear that this revolution that we're in the middle of is very akin to the Industrial Revolution. It's going to change pretty much everything around us. Our energy systems, our food systems, our material systems, our value, how we create value. And also let's also recognize we're in the midst of actually a human development revolution. The role of machine systems, machine learning, is going to force and drive a human development revolution as well. This is probably as profound as it gets as a transformation of our societies and our economies. And I think it's really critical that we start to see this next period is perhaps not the glorified cool buildings, funky looking buildings, but the mundane transformations of our built environment for a 3-degree future. It isn't about more buildings, maybe. Do you know how often what the utilization rate of a school is? Approximately. Utilization rate of a school. How much of a school is used throughout the year? It's about 17%. 17.5, 18%. So the rest of the time, that material sits there redundant, not used. we are going to have to massively reimagine how we reuse our material economies in really radical ways. Loads of things I can talk about, but I'm going to slip through some of this stuff. Back one. So in terms of designing for a constraint-driven future, I want to show this slide because I think it's really critical. So the average UK house, most people don't talk about embodied carbon. They talk about use carbon, in-use carbon. But the average UK house has 800 kilograms per meter squared of carbon, embodied carbon. The best, right, the best sort of bespoke low-carbon home gets to about 150 kilograms. We have to get to 6.3. 6.3. Now, why that's important is if you were to build out of hempcrete, or if you were to build about rammed earth, you get to 7.5. Just to give you how far we're off. We're not like marginally off. There have been debates in the UK right now about whether we should have a moratorium on building, whether we actually have the carbon budgets to be building. So how many homes do you think all of Europe can afford to build if it was compliant to the Paris Accord? How many homes? All of Europe. The current target is about 1.5 million homes a year. If it was to live within the Paris Accord, it's about 144 to 170,000 homes a year. The UK alone has targets between 350,000 homes a year, Germany 500,000. The UK can afford to build 14,000 homes a year. Why I'm saying this stuff is the constraints are going to reimagine the futures in radical ways. We've just never been used to living in constraints. We've thought the world was resource available, abundant in our ability to consume the resources and be able to transform them. And to get down from 150 to 6.3 is going to require all sorts of strategies. We're going to have to talk about programmable buildings, buildings which are not single program use. We're going to have to shift our theory of comfort. We're going to have to drive material innovation. We're going to have to effectively rebuild all the ecological services around those environments to keep them cool in different ways. All stack of stuff is going to be required. Super lightweight construction in material density, material use, textile-based constructions, recycled. All sorts of things are going to have to happen to get anywhere close to those numbers, and we're going to have to rebuild our energy grid at the same time in order to get there. I find this just revealing. And this doesn't include, by the way, any of the embodied carbon of the technologies to be able to process this work. So if you look back at the previous slide, you're at 6.3. We're nowhere close. So my big encouragement to you is embrace the constraints. Certainly for a short period, I suspect for 20 to 30 years, till we've rebuilt our energy infrastructure, which is almost certainly first generation going to be micronuclear infrastructure, as well as other things. We're going to move through an energy cycle. Only on the other side of that, if we, in 40 years' time, if human civilization is still functional and we've rebuilt our energy infrastructure, will we open up a new energy domain landscape, which will open these things up? Certainly for the next 30, 40 years, constraints are going to shift what we innovate and how we innovate. And we're going to have to start to think about entangled value. And our theory of how we orchestrate value is going to be fundamentally different. This is a piece of work we did looking at a private house and the costs it generates, actually, even though it's a private house, for all other parties, badly performing house and all of this stuff. How many of you here own a home? Right. So the benefits of the home are yours, right? So if you own a second home, the benefits are yours, but the social costs are all distributed. I'm going to give you a really interesting example. This is some work we did on the High Line, which, let's see if it works. Yeah, cost about 187 million to build. this is what it did in terms of land value uplift. Now, there's a reason why I'm getting here. And the tax benefit was this. So many of you own a home, right? And your home probably in the last 10 years has gone up massively in value. Yes? Probably more than what you earn, even perhaps. If I was to take your home and move it to Siberia, how much is your home worth? Nothing. Nothing. You can't even get the money out. So where's the value of your home coming from? Is it the home? No. It's coming from, here's the key words, the monopolistic access to public goods. Labor markets, transportation, schools, cultural infrastructure. So what's really inflated in value, if you've improved your house, put a new bathroom in, whatever, it's marginal, is actually public goods have gone up in value, and the value has been privatized in the hands of homeowners. The value has been privatized in the hands of landowners or homeowners. So the common goods have inflated, and you can see this with the High Line. It's a really great example. 187 million to build, 3.48 billion in land value uplift, entirely privatized. So you can see the entanglement value both in positive and negative terms. And we're going to have to rethink all of these things. We're doing a lot of work around how to construct new forms of contracts around this sort of stuff. And this also applies to simple things like trees. And there's a reason why I'm going into this conversation. So a tree, for example, an urban tree, is largely not, we as designers often draw trees. We've got a nice tree. After 10 years, Sheffield City Council chops it down. Why do you think it chops it down? Because of accounting. Because a tree's ecological benefit is not on the balance sheet of the local authority, but the insurance and the maintenance costs are. Right? So after 10 years, you chop it down, you plant a new tree. But the ecological benefits of trees arrive 40 years down the line, when actually the cooling effect, all sorts of things are put onto the table. So here's another one which I think just shows how we're organizing value in a misappropriated way. So most trees that are planted, 97% of trees that are planted are male trees. How would you know that? They're male because that's the lowest maintenance cost. However, as a result of them being all male, asthma levels are very high. But that moves from the Department of Maintenance and Trees and Environment, but to a public budget on health. But they're not their budgets. So how we organize value and how we understand system value is a real problem. Flood risks and other things. Most of our innovation is going to be focused on what I would talk about is intersectional investments. Investments which have multi-party benefits and organize those multi-party benefits in different ways. There's all sorts of work we're doing on trees as infrastructure around this sort of stuff. So one of the things that I want to point out is that I think one of the big things that we're going to have to do is move from single point optimization of value, so what's the value of a single point, to actually multi-point optimization. So how do you invest in a tree canopy so it has flood risk management effects, heat cooling effects, community engagement effects, all the way through to actually road maintenance cost reductions, all sorts of things. How do you design things from those multi-beneficiary effects? And not only how do you design them, how do you contract them? And how do you finance them for that reality? So, but this also requires us to imagine new forms of material economy. I found this beautiful. Like a colleague of my work is from Taiwan, and she brought it up, FANG. And I was like, that's so beautiful in terms of how you understand the material economy. And it challenges all of our theory of ownership of materials. And why I'm saying this is that if we're going to move into this next generation, our relationship with materials and our relationship with ownership is fundamentally going to have to change. And I don't mean the sharing economy of the 1990s or 2000s, which is basically a rent-seeking fractional rent economy. But how do you organize this form of stewardship? You know, if you was to, my shirt, it's not an expensive shirt, whatever, £45 shirt. If you were to true cost that shirt in terms of social environmental cost, true costing of it, it's closer between 250 to 450 pounds. 250 to 450 pounds. If you did true cost the price of a house and the construction of a price of a house, no one can afford it. So we're going to have to change all of our material economies and ownership economies to deal with actually a true cost economy. Because if we carry on externalizing all our costs, we're all dead in the water. And this changes all sorts of things. Again, we're doing work on material, sort of new forms of trust infrastructures. So post-ownership, where you're not owning it, all the batteries are put into a trust infrastructure. So there's new forms of institutions that are going to have to be built to be able to organize these economies so they don't become rent-seeking. And I think this invites us to design a different way into the world, beyond ownership, into treaty and in relationship models. And some of the work we're doing is about actually moving away from the idea of treating the world either as a resource or an asset, but to actually start to see the world through a theory of agents. So again, some of the brilliant work that was done by Jonathan Lapalme at our organization with people like John Burroughs, who's an indigenous lawyer in Canada, he would talk about actually the nation of trees. A new type of material relationship with the world. And I think there's something very provocative and interesting about the re-agentification of the world. If you start to re-agentify the world, not treat it through a theory of ownership, you start to be able to deal with multi-point optimization. So if a house is not only about for your benefit, but is actually an ecological system for multi-point benefits, you start to imagine its theory of development and organization in a radically different way. So the re-agentification of the world, and I think we've just written about this in terms of life-enabling economies as a whole piece of work that Emily Harris and myself and Martin have put out there, starts to talk about a different economic frame of operating in complexity. And this opens up, we're doing this work of a home that owns itself. And it's much more intricate than that. It's about relationships of stewardship with our homes, new relationships of materiality where the matter is held in trust and is a surface relationship. The land becomes self-sovereign. You have this bundle of reimagination of the contracts which change the nature of how we relate to the world around us. Again, we're doing something around cameras. If a surveillance camera is not owned by somebody, but is in a relationship of care with an environment, you change your whole theory of sensing and surveillance state versus surveillance capitalism to a new theory of actually agentified worlds in relationship of care with the world. What does that look like? And I think, for me, one of the big questions and the kind of theses that I'm sort of trying to open up here is that the constraint space that we're facing is going to transform what we innovate, and it's also going to require us to transform our relationship, our contracts, our theory of governance, our theory of ownership around those economies. And I would argue that we're living in a kind of a massive transformation of our relationship with the world. The last 400 years have been rooted in a theory of what I would say separation with the world. We've seen the world through separation. We've seen the world through objectification. We've objectified things. We've separated ourselves and objectified them. We've constructed, I would argue even perspective was a means to distance ourselves from the world. It forced distance on the world. And it also allowed us, our languages, English, for example, as a language has become increasingly noun-orientated and object-orientated. What we've done is a classification theory is all about separation. So, for example, classification theories, and many of you will be very well aware of this. For example, if you look at genetic diversity, if you look at the African continent has greater genetic diversity than the rest of the whole fucking world. Right? Yet our classification theory is rooted in primary forms of color, because that color permitted a violence. The separation was a theory of separation that permitted violence. The problem is that landscape of how we've organized the world no longer works, because the externalities of all those separations and distances are now effectively feedbacking into us. And those feedbacks are self-terminating. Those feedbacks are self-terminating. Right? So we're living at a profound transformation of our relationship with the world. And property, labor, all these things are a means of instrumentalization, a means of objectification, and the means of separation. So one of the most profound things I feel is that we're living in a worldview shift. Not just a shift of what we make and what services we construct, but actually a worldview shift. A shift of how we operate and think and exist in the world. The reality is that we are all multitudes, right? Biologically, that's not difficult. Less than 40% of you is human DNA. You're a symbiosis with other forms of organisms and parasites that co-live with you to create your consciousness. That is biologically true. Right? Even in terms of your brain is actually a social, you have a spectrum of identities. You're not a single identity, you're a plurality. Yet we all live with the construct of the I, the me. But actually, if we were honest with ourselves, the greatest honesty would be that we should all be talking about ourselves as we, they, them. Because that's reflectively true of who we are. So this revolution that we're in the middle of is a revolution of how we imagine ourselves. It's a revolution of how we relate to the world. And I think it's about to change everything around us. Now, you could sit there and very easily argue that the choices we face are the choices that if we don't do this, I think we're self-terminating. People like Daniel Schmachtenberger. Many of you may have heard of him. Again, I'd really encourage you to listen to him. Very brilliant speaker and thinker about existential risk. The choice we have is the choice to make this transition. That's the choice. There's no other pathway to survival. I've sat in rooms, and I'm going to say this, I've sat in rooms and somebody said, well, Indy, there's only going to be 1 billion people, the planet can only afford 1 billion people on the world. That's what, I've sat in the room, and I said it, and I've said, okay, give me a pathway that you think we lose 7 billion people without effectively we wiping out the whole human race. The availability of biowarfare, information warfare, micronuclear, we won't survive. And there is no New Zealand strategy. Let me also say that. New Zealand during COVID didn't have paracetamol. In fact, all of Europe was producing not one paracetamol during COVID. All of Europe. So, we won't have antibiotics. They didn't have antibiotics, didn't have paracetamol, didn't actually have the ability to produce the PPPs that were required, the plastics overalls. So isolationism was the only viable strategy. So the challenge that we face is that we have a problem space that's going to require planetary transformation. And the choice is we don't have a choice. And one of the most interesting pieces of work that we're doing, somebody said, we've just got to prove that no one can win this scenario. Once you realize you can't win the other scenario, actually there's only one reality, which is the speed and scale that we transform in. And my simple plea to you, and we'll hopefully go into questions and discussions, is that I don't think it's a linear extrapolation of where we are now. That's not what the future looks like to me. It's just not a linear extrapolation. This is probably a structural shift in how we make society around us that we've ever seen. And I think that's a massive invitation to you as designers and makers of tomorrow. And it requires you to engage in the full spectrum of the problem space in a way that I don't think we're often invited as designers to engage in. That, I think, is a massive opportunity and a massive need. So, my thing about this is that we're going to have to think about this stack of problems. This is where it's pretty much my last slide, so I'll open up in a bit. We are seeing foundational shifts in our ecological systems, our CO2 levels, all of these things, our water issues. If you look at any of these layers, you're seeing foundational shifts. We're going to have to see all sorts of things, transformations in the implicate order, all the way, language, imagined self, how we understand landscapes of hope, all the way through, how we construct decisions as societies. Representative decision models are really terrible at dealing with complexity. Our democracies cannot deal with the scale and speed of decision-making that's required. They can't construct the legitimacy at the right speed. So how do you build the capabilities of societies to be able to do that? All of this stuff is going to be transformed, and that's going to transform what we make and the world we construct around us. That, for me, is a massive invitation to you as designers and as makers of the world. And my one thing is just look at the constraints. I'm sort of so tired of people showing me timber homes, like and saying this is the future. Yes, it is, just 30 years down the line. Unless we built the land use transition, we don't have the biomaterial economy. Unless you're in Sweden, by the way. Right? Remember, a timber home on a global timber supply chain has 5% less carbon used, wasted, than concrete. So a timber home in Australia, the timber is grown in Australia, processed in USA, and brought back. So transformation of our biomaterial economy towards a biomaterial economy is about, remember, 40% of most of our forests are not sustainably managed. In fact, we're seeing a reduction in our ecological systems at net. So we're going to go through a difficult transformation towards building a biomaterial economy. We're going to have to make it recircular. We're going to have to build buildings which are deeply programmable, so we're not knocking down buildings after less than 25 years. How do you imagine the balance sheets of buildings? How do you imagine the asset codes of buildings in our built environment for that more than 25-year use? How do you build building regulations? Most buildings are 50 points over-engineered because we don't want deflection rates. What does live regulation mean when you massively have to dematerialize our material use of buildings? All of this stuff will change in different formats. So I think the world is there to be made, but I just implore you to look deep into the system. My final thing is, for me, is what I'm saying here isn't, I don't want to claim it as the truth, it's the stuff that we found out. But if nothing else, I hope it encourages you to look deeper into the problem. Right? That's my big plea. Don't have to take my words for truth. I wouldn't want you to. I think the power of society is to hold uncertainty and hold logics together. It's not truths. You figure it out, but I do implore you to look deeper into the problem, because I think it's going to change what design looks like in the 21st century. It's not going to be these fancy shapes that we keep drawing in many formats. So with that, thank you.
Do some questions. So thank you very much for that provocation, Indy. I'm sure that there are going to be questions from the audience. Just before we do, maybe I'd like to ask one. It seems that what you're describing here is, also the need for thinking about completely new kinds of values and new kinds of ethics that can help us deal with the fact that we have an enshrined system that favors more consumption rather than better consumption, of man-made capital rather than natural capital, supported by financial systems that privatize gains and socialize losses. Yeah. How do we develop the courses of action that can help us dismantle these kinds of institutionalized issues?
So I think one of the things that I'm finding, we're talking to all the way from central bankers to banks to, this is no longer a moral issue. So we often sit in rooms and people go, this is about efficacy. What's the viable pathway? You literally can't retrofit the whole city right now. It's not possible. You can't. We've looked at Birmingham, we've looked at 15 different cities all across Europe. You don't have the material economy, the labor economy, and other things. What we're realizing is reaching the end of a game of a particular way of organizing value. And if you were to true cost a house, and we're starting to see this, the market is starting to drive a forcing function of our material economy. Global volatility will increase, geopoliticization of our material supply chains will increase. It will force us to have a reprice the value. And in a sense, this is no longer a moral story for me. It's just follow the numbers, be really boring. And actually, it's also systemically about survival at the end of the story. So we're seeing the security debate massively transform the food systems question. We spoke about it for years, and then suddenly, as a result of some of the geopolitical issues that are going on, actually land use transition, food systems transition is now front and center of the debate. And we're going to see that with critical minerals, we're going to see that with our labor force conversations, they're going to be transformative. So none of this stuff for me is about, and we often end up in debates about morality. This is just about efficacy, the most efficacious use of our environment and being in relationship to the environment, which is now made possible by technology and capabilities that we had and we didn't have before. So you can do radical things with our material economy around theories of ownership, which is historically difficult to compute. So I'm less and less making moral arguments. I'm just it's more about efficacy.
But surely there has to be a kind of sense of being able to change our standards of value. Because if we remain with them, then we don't really have the driving underpin for those radical changes.
I think the example I use is a can of Coke versus an apple, right? A sustainably grown apple is regenerative of the soil, is regenerative in the environment, provides all sorts of things. When you eat it, it's rejuvenative of you and provides micronutrients, all of those things, right? And a can of cola is massively destructive in terms of ecological impacts, massively destructive for your health, massively destructive in terms of water systems, and cost about the same. So we've preferred the economy of the cola can. And, nice chairs do exactly the same as a cola, by the way. There's no difference. It looks different, looks nicer, but it's the same thing. So we've preferenced the economy all generated around externalization. The problem is that externalization is no longer possible because the externalities are self-terminating us. That's what I mean. It's no longer a moral conversation. We're talking to one of the second largest sugar producers in the world, and they were turning around saying, look, the way we've managed our soil and our land is that our soil is degraded, our security costs are going up, and effectively what we're seeing is we can't recruit the labor. So they are talking about, and there's a brilliant Harvard network on flourishing assets, saying how do we have a completely different asset management strategy, which is fundamentally about rejuvenating the soil, fundamentally about building human capital, and reducing inequality between their land and other actors, not as a means of a kind of, it's basically the most efficacious way of organizing, because the costs of doing otherwise are much higher, and those costs are no longer ignorable. And that's what I find fascinating, is that this world is moving at quite a rapid rate, when you can see one of the richest families in the world starting to have to reimagine asset management at quite a root level. And, and it's also coded, right? Soil is not on the balance sheet of a farm. Just isn't. Right? Like we talked about the tree, all the benefits aren't there. Soil is not on the balance sheet of a farm. Soil is effectively an endless resource which you consume from. So we are starting to see these recodes happening around us, and that's what gives me quite a lot of hope.
So we'll open up for questions. There's a question here at the front.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed your decolonial thinking, and I see we need more engagement with the more human world, and digital technologies are like making the invisible visible. Now we see like bioacoustics, biosemiotics. How can fabricators step into this to help?
So I think that's going to be a key part of the growth story and the development story. So I think all the way from whether it's biocompute and other capabilities, we're going to have to grow that. And I think we're seeing all sorts of innovations happening. The only thing I'd say is just let's be conscious. This is a developmental model that will take us time to build that. So this is not going to be a one-to-one transference. So I speak to, I don't know, one of the kind of best Faber Futures. They do brilliant work around bio, I can't remember what they're called, clothing and other formats. And it's incredible, but it's also recognizing we're so far away from that reality. And as you start to go down that, the costs are going to be different, the value is going to be different. I think you're right, that is the pathway we're going to have to go down. And I think the computational side, again, let's be really straightforward. I don't know how many saw, Microsoft is now building the first data center with a nuclear power backing. So we're going to see our information systems are going to have to be built from a different energy source to be able to build the compute for the worlds that we're talking about. So we're seeing quite a different territory open up as to be able to build those capabilities. So even what it looks like intangible economies of compute and information are rooted in a material economy, which is going to have to be made into that pathway. And I think that's a rich, complex problem. So, yeah, agree.
So, Philip.
Thank you for an unspeakably important talk. Thank you for sharing this with us, and thank you for inviting us to see that the human psyche also can harvest uncertainty and can gather uncertainty as one note of generating confidence. And yet I find the talk speaking of unspeakable emergency. And when I am counseled about my own transformations that I am capable of doing in efficacy, as you say, my Haudenosaunee, an elder who counsels me, tells me that the ice ages were tremendously essential in generating life, not just the times of warmth and heat and fire. And he counsels me that going slow as well as rushing is essential. Can you speak about how time's scales offer possibility?
Yeah, thank you so much for your kind words as well. Sorry, I found it really difficult standing on stage when sort of, especially in the question answer, so I stepped down. So two things. If you were to take a sort of a 1,000-year view, my view is that we're going through a massive learning period. So we as a civilization are moving from a period of competitive organizing to having to organize at a planetary interdependent way. And our capability to shift from competitive organizing to planetary organizing is actually a profound transformation to deal with a new theory of abundance. So I think in 40 years' time, human civilization, if we make it through, will be dealing with a new theory of abundance. Abundance that we've not even imagined. But it will take us 40 years to get there. And if you were to look at a long arc, people will look back at this moment as being a phase shift in our capabilities as civilization to go from this theory of abundance, a hydrocarbon and abundant framework, to a new abundance framework. And unless we built the tools and the institutional logics and our mind frames for that function, I think the abundance will kill us. So in a long arc, you could argue this is one of the most extraordinary transformation periods. So I sit in the long arc with quite a degree of comfort. And I also think that, if you were to talk about stuff like the Fermi paradox, the Fermi paradox is a moment that why don't we see that many civilizations? And one of the kind of conjectures is most civilizations don't make it through what is this competitive theory. So competitive organizing is a means of organizing and development, and then you have to become planetary at certain moments in time because your entanglements become big. And our ability to actually build that planetary level organizing is actually a profound transformation in our capabilities. So this is why also this moment rhymes with the past. So if you look back with indigenous ways of thinking and other forms of thinking, what you find is that we're rhyming with the past. It's not the past, by the way. I think this is a quantum entanglement. This is a different type of entanglement. It's a planetary scale entanglement. It's not the past, but it rhymes with the past. And there's a moment to learn from that. But at the long arc level, I think this is an extraordinary transformation moment. It's actually building our capabilities to live with abundance, is the way I'd frame it. So, hope that helps. Thank you. Anyone else? Right at the back.
Thank you so much for your talk, very inspiring. You talked about that governments or politicians in the European Union are pushing for constructing more and more housing, like hundreds of thousands, but at the same time we're facing huge demographic challenges like population shrinking significantly in the next 30 to 40 years. Like, why do you think is that? Can you talk a bit about this?
Yeah, so over the next, there's loads of complexity here. So one, if you look at the space per individual, massively increased across Europe. So individual per square meters, we've massively inflated the per square meter development. So I think there's been a kind of overconsumption of that environment. And the second thing that I think is also really critical is that part of the problem is there is a social justice problem here. And people falsely are thinking, in my view, that you solve the social justice problem by building new homes. Right? Most new homes are not actually driving social justice on the table. But we have to recognize there is a social justice issue here. There are people across Europe living in pretty difficult environments, and not just across Europe, around the world. But Europe is going to have to constrain its material economy in order to relieve space, material space, for the African continent, which is going to go by 800 million people. India and other places. So we're going to see the shift of the material economy. That's going to be a key part of this transition. But I think there is sufficient material economy available, and this is where Europe has the advantage of actually building what I would call the construction and deconstruction economy, programmable buildings, a new way of organizing value and sharing value in much more rich terms. So I think we have to deliver social justice through a different means. I don't think it'd be delivered through new material consumption. I just don't think we have it. It'll take us time to build a biomaterial economy. I think it'll take us 20 years to rebuild our forests, rebuild agroforestry frameworks, rebuild our rewilded food systems, and controlled environment food systems and VAT-grown food systems. And then it will also leave space for a biomaterial regenerative economy, which then has to be part of a natural replacement cycle over 40 years. So people like John Schnellhuber, Professor John Schnellhuber, who talks very beautifully about the role of using forest sinks across Europe to over 500 years to suck up the carbon over a longitudinal period. So I think this is a big macro sort of landscape scale shift that we're in the middle of. But yeah, those are some of the reasons that are on the table. But yeah, fair point. Thank you.
So there's one more question, I think, before we have a coffee break. Also.
Hi.
Oh, yeah. First of all, thank you so much for an inspiring presentation. I'm still early in my studies of architecture and have a certain degree of freedom also to engage with the existing society. But I'm also curious if you can elaborate on your ways of engaging with the existing societal world, and at the same way that you talk about this shift, because I think, including myself, for my future, for many of us, this radical shift seems almost unthinkable, but at the same time so needed, and that's the only option. So how do you, in that way, engage both personally, but also in your practice with others as this I and the we, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so many different layers to that. One, I think one of the things I would just really encourage us to do is that the biggest resistance in these conversations I found, or not resistance, non-belief, let's put it non-belief, is actually the design economy. They're the last movers in this, because the reason is because most of the design economy exists in the age of consultancy, right? And for consultancy to exist, what happens is I have to be able to understand the problem and give you a consultancy contract to solve that problem. And so the design economy typically exists largely as an instructable economy. Whereas actually, I think the role of design is largely about synthesizing complex functions that are outside what I would call knowable spaces. So the problem of design space is how do you reimagine care for a neighborhood? It's not about the service design, it's the thesis of care. That could be physical problems, that could be service problems, it could be social ways of organizing all of those things as an intersection. So one of the big challenges that we've got is most of the design economy has been instrumentalized through a theory of consultancy, which I think has reduced our capabilities to deal with the problems and the nature of the problems. So the second point of the liberation is once you take that approach, the economy of design in that world is massive. We're a 60-person team. We're not a small organization in design terms. We're a 60-person team. We could be double that, right? So this is not an economy problem of there, but it does require a different theory of design teams. We have all the way from finance people, lawyers, we have coders, we have completely different capabilities to what a traditional design studio would hold. Second, we're not designed from the idea of a CEO. The hero designer doesn't work in complexity because no designer can understand the complexity of the problems. The highest paid to the lowest paid is a 2-to-1 ratio in our organization, and I'm not the highest paid even though I'm the founder because we haven't organized our pay on the basis of who's more senior. It's based on who needs support. So somebody young could be looking after parents and have kids and they need more support. So we've changed our pay structure. So in order to build these economies of design which allow for complex collaboration, you need to change the institution and the organization of design, what the design team really is, as well as the problem space. I don't think this is a problem of economy. We're fortunate enough to be in rooms with CEOs of banks and other people. They all know this is coming. And that's the other part. I do worry from a designer sense. I find there isn't the engagement in what I would call the deep research because we're locked into architectural research, which unfortunately is really impoverished. I think architectural research is one of the weakest in the fields. So most of the research we end up having to go for is material scientists, sociologists, all the other fields to get to root level. So I'd really encourage getting deeper into the research landscapes, which are intersectional. And you operate at the intersection of these researches. But your contribution is the synthesis across those research. And our ability to do that will be really critical. So that's the way I would look at the space. And I think my big thing to you, the world is moving much faster than designers are. I think that is the problem. The world is moving much faster than I think the design economy is able to respond. So what I'm now seeing from the design economy is what I would call symbolism of these futures, right? So, we'll draw a drawing of this future. But to make that future is more than a drawing. We'll draw a drawing of strategic design because it looks like a map that has strategy and type of it. But it's not that. So that's where I would really talk about what does it mean for design to be a strategic co-partner. So most of our engagements are not consultancy, they're partnership engagements, even with big corporations, where we own the intellectual property together, where we are genuine partners in both the financing and organizing. So we've changed the financing model of the organism. So I think this requires a different economy of design at a fundamental level, but my big plea to you is this isn't a demand problem. The world out there needs far more of this than I think designers are able and willing to provide right now. That's what I think is really there. Thank you.
So we have one final question from Areti.
Hi, thank you.
Hello.
Indy. Thank you for the uncomfortable talk, actually. I do not eat meat, but I also do not build much. No, because we are coming from the research territory, the architectural and manufacturing research territory, and although I do believe a lot into the power of crowd in terms of crowdsourcing, crowd economy, crowd science, in the bottom-up process of, bringing really many actions together to bring a lot of impact, I also see that this is not possible because we do try to build with earth, but who is controlling, the contamination of soil? We do want and try to build with biomaterials or timber, but then, the sustainable management of forest or agriculture is actually at, different hands of control. And then we do want to try to work with upcycled materials, but then, there are no standards about embodied carbon in building industry, only about operational carbon. So I just wonder how this, whereas there is really a way that this kind of bottom-up, initiative and process could couple or affect the top-down or a global plan, that it is necessary. Otherwise, we are naive if we think that it is not.
Yeah, I totally agree. I would say every one of the things you mentioned is a strategic design opportunity. So you're right. There aren't the standards in terms of embodied carbon. Okay. Who wants to design the standards for embodied carbon? What's the lifetime management? What's the balance sheet of a 21st century building? Every one of the things that you say, for me, is a design problem right now. So even the provenance of how we manage timber supply chains and sustainable forest management, and is there such a thing as sustainable forest management, the way we do it? Agroforestry, is that the only way it works? Is it end-of-life management? How do you create the provenance of those chains? How do you maintain that? I think that is all, right now, a design problem. So if I was running a design studio, I'd be opening it up to all of that dark matter and saying, design. Because I think that's a massive opportunity and a need right now. I think every age, the Industrial Revolution was built on new forms of standards. There's been a brilliant piece of work that's been done by Vinktash Rao on the summer of protocols and looking at protocol-based design and looking at sort of the theory of protocols as a means of organizing. I think we're going to see a revolution in standards. And our revolution in standards in really radical formats to be able to deal with that. And I think that's all an opportunity, I would argue. So I think there's whole new spaces opening up for design to be able to open those conversations up. But it's going to require legal design. It's going to require sort of computational capabilities, spatial computing capabilities, all sorts of things that I don't think we're fully engaging with at this moment in time. Certainly we're starting to, but we're not properly engaged with. But yeah, I think it's all an opportunity. Thank you.